What would you do if the person you were planning to marry just disappeared without explanation, without a conversation, without any warning? That's exactly what happened to me. My fiancée, Julie, decided that she needed a break from the relationship and went on a tour of South Asia with her friends from university, blocking me out everywhere before she left. And when she finally called me after 5 weeks of silence, as if nothing had happened, I made a decision the wedding was off. But I had no idea how far she would go to twist the situation and get me back. Jack had always believed that he and Emily were solid. After 7 years together, their relationship had weathered ups and downs, but nothing had ever shaken the foundation they had built. Or so he thought. Their wedding was just months away. The plans had been finalized, invitations sent, and deposits paid. Everything was falling into place for the life they had envisioned together. Then, without warning, Emily dropped a bombshell. It was an early Saturday morning when she casually mentioned her upcoming trip. Jack had just poured himself a cup of coffee when she, sitting across from him at the kitchen table, said, "So, I'm going to Southeast Asia for a few weeks with my college friends. It's a once-in-a-lifetime thing." The words didn't register at first. Jack took a sip of his coffee, thinking she was joking. "When?" he asked absently. "In 2 weeks. We've already booked everything." Now he was paying attention. The casual, offhand nature of her statement didn't match the weight of the situation. 2 weeks? A big trip? Without discussing it with him first? Jack blinked, setting his cup down. "Wait, you've already booked it?" Emily nodded, scrolling through her phone as if this were just another ordinary conversation. "Yeah, it was a spontaneous thing. Sarah found a great deal, and everyone jumped on board. I didn't think you'd mind. It's just a few weeks." Jack swallowed the unease creeping up his spine. A few weeks away, in another country, right before their wedding? How was he only hearing about this now? "I'm just surprised," he said carefully. "You never mentioned wanting to go on a trip. And with everything going on with the wedding, it just seems like weird timing." She waved a dismissive hand. "That's exactly why I need it. Wedding planning has been exhausting. I just need to clear my head. I'll come back refreshed, and everything will be fine." Jack forced a nod, but something about this didn't sit right with him. They had always discussed their decisions together, especially big ones like this. The fact that she had booked an international trip without even mentioning it felt wrong. Still, he didn't push it. Maybe she really did need a break before the wedding chaos took over. Maybe he was just overreacting. But then came the real shock. 2 weeks later, he drove her to the airport, helping her with her luggage and trying to suppress the uneasy feeling in his chest. He told himself to be supportive, to trust her. As they walked toward the security checkpoint, Emily turned to him with an expression that was far too casual for what she was about to say. "Oh, and one more thing," she said lightly. "I think we should take a break while I'm gone." Jack stopped in his tracks, his brain struggling to process what she had just said. "What?" Emily glanced around as if this was just an everyday conversation and not the unraveling of their future. "Just while I'm away. Time apart to think." His mouth went dry. "You're telling me this now? Right before you get on a plane?" She sighed, adjusting the strap of her bag. "Jack, I don't want to fight about this. I just think it'll be good for us. A little space." He felt like the ground had been ripped out from under him. Before he could say anything, she was already waving goodbye and disappearing into the crowd. The drive home felt like an out-of-body experience. His mind replayed the conversation, trying to make sense of it. It wasn't just the words. It was the way she had said them. So casual, so indifferent, as if she hadn't just blindsided him with one of the biggest decisions of their relationship. Still, he held on to a sliver of hope that maybe she had just been overwhelmed. Maybe once she got to her destination, she'd realize this was a mistake and call him to talk it out. But that never happened. Instead, when he tried calling her later that night, he was met with a dead tone. Blocked. Jack stared at his phone in disbelief. Texts? Undelivered. Social media? He was locked out from every platform where they had once shared their lives. It was as if she had vanished completely, cutting him off from any way of reaching her. The realization hit him like a punch to the gut. This wasn't just some impulsive decision. She had planned this. She had meant it. The woman he was supposed to marry had walked away from their life together without so much as a proper conversation, leaving him in limbo. Jack sat in silence for hours that night, staring at the wedding plans that suddenly felt like a cruel joke. For 5 days, he held on to the faintest hope that she would come to her senses. But as each silent day passed, that hope eroded. He wasn't going to beg. He wasn't going to wait around for someone who had treated him like an afterthought. So he made a decision. The wedding was off. Every booking, every arrangement, every single thing they had spent months planning, he canceled it all. The moment he called the venue to withdraw their reservation, a weight lifted off his chest. He wasn't the one who had walked away, but he could at least take control of what happened next. And one thing was certain. Emily was not moving in with him when she returned. That had been the plan. She was supposed to move into his apartment in March. But now, she could figure out her own living situation because he was done making room for someone who had so easily discarded him. The weeks passed, and still, not a single word from Emily. Jack focused on moving forward, even considering taking a trip himself. If she could run off to Southeast Asia for weeks without a second thought, why shouldn't he do the same? He refused to let himself be the one left behind, stuck in the wreckage of something that no longer existed. Then, out of nowhere, she called. Jack didn't recognize the number at first. She must have been using a different phone. When he answered, her voice was as nonchalant as ever. "Hey, I'll be back on Thursday morning. My flight lands at 10 a.m. He paused for a moment, letting her words settle before calmly replying, "What's that got to do with me?" The silence on the other end was deafening. For the first time, she was the one left speechless. Jack didn't wait for an answer. He hung up and immediately blocked her number, just as she had done to him weeks ago. The chapter was closed, and for the first time in weeks, Jack felt free. After Jack ended the call and blocked Emily's number, a strange sense of calm settled over him. For weeks, he had been trapped in an emotional whirlwind, questioning everything he thought he knew about their relationship. But now, the path forward was clear. He wasn't going to be someone's afterthought. He had spent enough time waiting for an explanation that never came, and it was time to move on. The first step was reclaiming his space. Emily had left behind remnants of their life together in his apartment. Clothes, books, small personal items that once made the place feel like theirs. Now, they felt like ghosts of a future that would never happen. Jack methodically packed everything into boxes, sealing away the memories one by one. He didn't rush. There was something almost therapeutic about the process, a quiet assertion that he was taking control of his own life again. Canceling the wedding had already been a major turning point, but there were still loose ends to tie up. He contacted vendors, ensuring that every trace of their plans was erased. Surprisingly, he didn't feel the deep pang of loss he expected. Instead, there was relief. The idea of standing at the altar with someone who could abandon him so easily now seemed absurd. What he mourned was not the loss of Emily, but the illusion of who he thought she was. Friends and family had mixed reactions. Some were shocked, unable to comprehend how someone could throw away a years-long relationship with such indifference. Others, particularly his close friends, were furious on his behalf. Jack appreciated their support, but didn't dwell on their outrage. He wasn't interested in dissecting Emily's actions any further. He had done enough of that in the sleepless nights following her departure. Instead, he focused on himself. For too long, his identity had been intertwined with their relationship, with the future they had meticulously planned. Now, he was forced to rediscover who he was outside of that dynamic. He returned to hobbies he had once set aside for the sake of compromise. He reconnected with old friends, strengthening relationships that had taken a back seat while he had been consumed by wedding preparations. He started going to the gym again, channeling his emotions into something productive rather than letting them fester. He also began considering a trip of his own. The irony wasn't lost on him. Emily had vanished to find herself, and now he was contemplating doing the same. But his reasons were different. He didn't need to escape responsibility or pause his life to see if he wanted commitment. He wanted to experience something new, to remind himself that his world didn't end with a failed engagement. Researching destinations, planning an itinerary. These were things he could control, things that symbolized forward motion rather than stagnation. As the days passed, thoughts of Emily became less frequent. The initial sting of betrayal dulled, replaced by an understanding that sometimes people reveal who they truly are when you least expect it. Jack didn't need closure from her. She had given him all the answers he needed through her actions. The woman who had once promised forever had proven she wasn't capable of honoring that commitment. The final step in letting go came unexpectedly. One evening, while going through some old emails, he stumbled upon a draft of his wedding vows. He hadn't looked at them since before Emily left, and as he read through the heartfelt words, he felt no sadness, only clarity. That promise was never meant for the person she had become. He deleted the file without hesitation, closing the laptop with a sense of finality. Jack wasn't bitter. He wasn't waiting for an apology or a dramatic reconciliation. He was simply done, and that, more than anything, was the real victory. Moving forward wasn't about forgetting, it was about no longer caring. And for the first time in a long time, he was truly free. Jack had finally reached a point where the weight of his past no longer dictated his present. After weeks of emotional turmoil, canceled plans, and learning to navigate a world without Emily, he was ready to take the next step. Moving forward wasn't just about forgetting. It was about reclaiming everything he had put on hold while entangled in a relationship that had ultimately unraveled. His mornings felt different now. There was no lingering dread, no instinct to check his phone for messages that would never come. Instead, his days began with a sense of purpose. He established new routines, ones that had nothing to do with wedding preparations or adjusting his life to fit someone else's expectations. His workouts became a source of clarity, an outlet for all the energy he had previously channeled into salvaging a relationship that had already been lost. He pushed himself harder, not to prove anything to anyone, but to remind himself that his body and mind were his own to strengthen. Work, once a background element in his life, now took on new meaning. Before, everything had revolved around shared goals with Emily, buying a house, saving for the future, planning vacations that now seemed laughable in hindsight. Without that structure, Jack poured himself into his career, rediscovering ambitions that had dulled over time. He took on new projects, sought out challenges he would have previously avoided, and excelled in ways he hadn't expected. His colleagues noticed the shift, commenting on his renewed focus and drive. Some assumed it was a distraction, a way to fill the void left by his broken engagement. But Jack knew better. He wasn't escaping. He was finally stepping into the life he had overlooked while trying to build one with someone who had never truly valued him. Friendships became more than just occasional gatherings or check-ins. He reached out to people he had lost touch with, making a conscious effort to reconnect. He accepted invitations without hesitation, something he hadn't done in years. Whether it was a casual drink after work or a weekend hiking trip, Jack embraced these moments fully, understanding that relationships, real, meaningful ones, required effort and presence. Unlike Emily, who had distanced herself before disappearing altogether, Jack valued the people who stood by him. Their support had been instrumental in getting through the worst of it, and he wasn't going to take that for granted. Travel became more than an idea. It was a necessity. Jack had spent weeks imagining what it would be like to take a trip purely for himself, with no compromises, no need to accommodate someone else's desires. So he booked a flight. The destination didn't matter as much as the act itself. The simple fact that he could make a decision entirely for himself, without waiting for approval or consideration of someone else's schedule, was liberating. When he arrived at his destination, he felt a sense of freedom he hadn't known in years. He explored new places, immersed himself in unfamiliar cultures, and experienced the joy of solitude without loneliness. Through these experiences, Jack gained something invaluable: perspective. He realized that his relationship with Emily had been over long before she boarded that plane. Her departure wasn't a betrayal that came out of nowhere. It was simply the final act of a story that had been unraveling for a long time. He had ignored the signs, convinced himself that love meant enduring discomfort, that commitment meant sacrificing parts of himself to make things work. But now, standing on the other side of it, he saw the truth. A real partnership didn't require abandonment to seek clarity. It didn't demand isolation to understand its worth. Jack stopped wondering about Emily. He no longer cared if she regretted her choices or if she had fabricated excuses to justify her actions. He had nothing left to say to her, no lingering desire to confront her, no unresolved emotions tying him to the past. What she did or didn't do was irrelevant to the life he was building now. As time passed, Jack understood that moving on wasn't about rushing into something new or proving anything to anyone. It was about learning to live on his own terms, to find joy in his independence, and to appreciate the people and opportunities that had always been there, waiting for him to notice. He wasn't just recovering, he was thriving. And for the first time in a long time, his future belonged entirely to him. Jack had moved forward, but the past had a way of resurfacing when least expected. For weeks, he had felt lighter, untethered from the weight of his failed engagement. He had rebuilt his life with purpose, embraced new opportunities, and found solace in the independence that had once seemed daunting. Yet, closure wasn't something that came neatly wrapped with a final goodbye. It often arrived in the form of loose ends, unexpected messages, and remnants of a past that still sought resolution. One evening, after returning from a long day at work, Jack noticed an unfamiliar number flashing on his phone. He hesitated before answering, knowing instinctively that it had something to do with Emily. He wasn't wrong. The message was short and carefully worded, a simple request to talk. It wasn't dramatic or desperate, but it carried an air of expectation, as though she assumed he was waiting for this moment. Jack had no interest in rehashing the past, but he also knew that ignoring it completely wouldn't erase what had happened. He had spent too much time giving her control over his emotions. Letting her dictate the terms of their breakup had been her power move, but she had no say in how he chose to move on. A response wasn't necessary. He had already said everything he needed to say when he canceled the wedding and walked away. But still, the past had a strange way of nudging at unresolved corners of the mind, tempting closure even when it wasn't needed. For days, Jack debated whether responding would provide any benefit. Would it grant him peace? Would it reinforce his decision to let go? Or was it simply an old habit, the reflex to engage, to seek understanding where none existed? He knew better than to fall into that trap again. Emily had made her choices without considering his feelings. She had left him to deal with the aftermath while she traveled the world, detached from responsibility. There was no justification that would change what she had done, no explanation that would rewrite history. Instead of responding, Jack revisited the list of things he had accomplished since she had left. He thought about the weight he had shed, both emotionally and physically, the clarity he had gained, and the future he was now actively shaping. He realized that nothing she could say would alter that. His life had already shifted into something stronger, more defined, and filled with new experiences that had nothing to do with her. The final step in his healing came not from a conversation, but from the realization that closure wasn't something another person could provide. It was something he had already found within himself. He didn't need to hear an apology, nor did he need to forgive her for his own peace of mind. What he needed was to trust that he had done the right thing by walking away, and that his life was better for it. As the days passed, he deleted the message without a second thought. He no longer needed to entertain the idea of closure, because he had already closed the door himself. Emily was part of a life that no longer belonged to him, a chapter he had read to its bitter end. Jack was finally free, not because he had let go of the past, but because he had embraced the present with open arms. The final break had never been about her. It had always been about reclaiming himself, and he had done exactly that. Jack had closed the door on his past, but true freedom came not just from leaving something behind, but from stepping fully into something new. The months following his final decision to ignore Emily's message brought an unexpected lightness to his life. Without the weight of a broken engagement hanging over him, he saw the world differently, not as a series of obligations and compromises, but as an open landscape filled with potential. He had spent too long measuring his life by someone else's expectations, and now, for the first time in years, he was truly living for himself. The habits that had once been distractions became integral parts of his new life. His morning runs weren't just about clearing his mind anymore. They became meditative, a reminder of the strength he had gained. His work took on new meaning, not as an escape, but as an avenue to build something real and fulfilling. Opportunities he had once hesitated to take now felt like doors swinging open, and he walked through them with confidence. He found himself volunteering for projects he previously avoided, taking chances in ways he never had before. Where there had once been hesitation, now there was action. One of the biggest changes came with travel. What had once been an idea to counterbalance the pain of Emily's sudden departure, became something much deeper. Jack took his first solo trip, boarding a plane with no real expectations other than to experience something new. What he found was a version of himself he had almost forgotten, a person who was curious, excited, and capable of embracing the unknown without fear. He wandered through unfamiliar streets, tasted foods he had never tried before, and sat in quiet observation of places untouched by his past. In those moments, he realized he was no longer running from anything. He was simply moving forward. The friendships he had rekindled became the foundation of his new support system. Gone were the days of feeling obligated to explain himself, to justify his emotions, or to pretend he was fine when he wasn't. He surrounded himself with people who valued honesty, who encouraged him to embrace the changes happening in his life. Conversations were no longer centered around what had happened, but around what was next. He didn't have to convince anyone, least of all himself, that he was better off now. It was evident in the way he carried himself, the ease in his laughter, and the peace he felt even in moments of solitude. Jack had thought that moving on required a dramatic shift, something visible, something tangible. But he learned that true healing was quieter. It was in the nights where he no longer reached for his phone, expecting a message. It was in the mornings where he woke up without the lingering heaviness of disappointment. It was in the simple joys, finding a new favorite coffee shop, reading a book without distraction, enjoying a sunset without the urge to share it with someone who no longer mattered. There were no sudden revelations, no grand gestures marking the moment he had fully moved on. It was a gradual process, one that happened in increments, in the small decisions that led him further from who he had been and closer to who he was meant to become. The past had shaped him, but it did not define him. He had loved, he had lost, and now he was free to love again, not just romantically, but to love life in a way he hadn't before. One day, he stumbled upon an old photograph of him and Emily, buried in a folder he had long forgotten. He looked at it for a moment, waiting for the familiar pang of sadness or regret. But there was none. Instead, there was only recognition of a different time, a different version of himself. He closed the folder, not with bitterness, but with acceptance. That chapter had ended, and ahead of him, the pages were blank, ready to be filled with something entirely his own. Jack wasn't just moving on, he was moving forward. And this time, he wasn't looking back.